You're just in time for your weekly, most comprehensive look at the world of business and economics. Welcome to Business Redefined. I am Julian Samboko. Tonight, I should say today, we are focusing on a very critical subject as far as global trade is concerned. And we are privileged to have on set the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Dr. Mukhisa Kitui. Welcome on set.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been a challenging year for global trade. COVID-19 was a disruptor, a curveball that many of us did not anticipate would have the scale of impact it has had. When you look at the situation as it is and looking into 2021 from a trade perspective, how do you see this unfolding?
Globally, there was a major disruption of trade, of course. Started first with the logistics of trade facilitation. Seamen who could not be allowed to get off ships, and therefore new seamen boarding ships at international ports of call. A mix of different and contradictory cross-border health inspection protocols for cross-border movement of trucks, but also importantly, a very significant and dramatic decline in global trade flows and investment flows. And this compounded an already existing challenge with the virtual collapse of air travel and the attendant hospitality industry. So these are some of the main areas that have been global trends, very significant. Global GDP shrinking, many developing countries averaging minus 5% GDP decline across the board in the course of just 1 year.
Kenya is in the process of negotiating a free trade area with the United States of America. And the basis of this is that we are preempting the lapsing of the AGOA Pact to try and create a streamlined exit from AGOA into a new trade arrangement. What are your thoughts on this, Dr.
First of all, I know the significance of AGOA to Kenya, although we could have done a lot better with the AGOA provisions than we've done. We still are stuck at $500 million per year as the export value of Kenya to the US. A number of things are important to me. If we're looking at the sunset of AGOA, the first port of call should be the team that negotiated AGOA can try to negotiate it jointly again. Kenya is not the largest beneficiary of AGOA on the African continent. Bigger beneficiaries are saying we can get a better deal on the wholesale market if we collectively engage Washington on the successor regime or an improved AGOA deal compliant with WTO requirements. And the strength in numbers instead of negotiating on the retail market as a single country. So that's one level of looking at it. The second level is that Kenya was caught into negotiating an FTA with a Washington that was dominated by the Trumpite thinking that destroy multilateral agreements and replace them with bilateral deals. As we enter the sunset of the Trump administration, I think it will be useful to pause a little. Try to second guess the incoming administration of Biden. If they're responsive to the mainstream popular African advocacy right now, that what we need is a renewed AGOA with necessary alterations, make it compliant with new SDG standards, make it compliant with the rules of WTO on reciprocity. This gives a better deal than what you go in individually. Third, Kenya is a member of a common market. When you're in a customs union, it requires very unique circumstances for you to go and negotiate individual bilateral agreement with a third party. Because what you do is the moment you give preferential market access to a third party, you start erecting customs barriers between you and your neighbors in the common market, in the customs union. So unless you have the compliance and acceptance of this as an East African phenomenon, you end up with problems. That's the difference between what the FTA Kenya is negotiating with the US and the post-Brexit agreement it just had with Britain. But there are two other reasons. Number one, Kenya was among the first 4 countries to sign the protocol for the establishment of an African continental free trade area. In the ACFTA protocol, all the signatories promised to freeze negotiations of trade agreements with third parties until the FTA had come into force. So the standstill promise is being breached for the first time by Kenya. The second thing, the CFTA promises that if a country offers preferential market access to a third party, it must offer the same provisions to all the other members of the Continental Free Trade Area. So if, for example, we follow what America is pushing, that it wants a removal of tariffs on American agricultural produce to Kenya, then the exemptions of export of sugar from Zambia, Sudan, that we have been using the quantitative limitations under COMESA will be wiped, because you must give Malawi and Zambia and Sudan the same unfettered market access to Kenya that you are giving to the US.
Dr. Kitui is talking about the ACFTA. One of the key concerns I get out here is that we are liberalizing our markets at a time when we know for a fact we have more competitive peers in Egypt, in South Africa. Shouldn't we have engaged in some sort of protectionism for our industry?
Kenya has not always been uncompetitive in its trade with other African countries. And what we have to do is say, in the period of the free trade area of COMESA, and in the era of the common market of the Customs Union of East Africa, what are the lessons learned about which sectors are we not competitive? What are the underpinning challenges that we need to address? Because going forward, there are a number of dynamics which make addressing those questions very important. The first and most important one is this: the global value chains or production networks are being dramatically changed. Even before COVID happened, there was a major shift that was happening in the world, that many countries, because of the rise in technological possibility, but also the rise in economic nationalism in some leading developed countries, many businesses are starting to reduce the distance between the source and the market. What is being called reshoring and regionalization. So that the main supply networks are between Mexico and the US, Canada and the US, neighboring countries like Mediterranean and European Union, East Asia and China. The long-distance footprint that has been so important in some of our thinking about trade negotiations is giving way to this. What does it mean? Africa will be forced to look at its neighborhood for trade. There has not been a sufficient discussion about the impact of devolution on enterprise Kenya. You are in a situation where, one, suppliers of capital goods are charged different levies by the local sales committees in different devolved governments. Secondly, products moving across the boundaries between counties are treated like they're crossing customs territory. So they're levy a local cess in every one of these areas. So if Kenya is going to survive and compete, it must rationalize the levies from devolved government and central government, in addition to reducing the overall overhang of energy costs.
The question of the shilling keeps on popping up, because in this year alone, we've seen the shilling slump from 101 to 111, about 9 percentage points down. The argument is then it makes our exports more competitive, never mind the other adversary effect it has. Do you think in this particular year we've had a dividend from the depreciation?
No. There are a number of things. A net importing country suffers the negative consequences of a weakening currency than a net exporter. You remember how China industrialized through deliberately weakening its currency when it was massively a net exporter. But a country which depends so much on 90% of pharmaceuticals consumed in Kenya are imported, manufactured base metals are being imported, different capital goods that are necessary for the economy to proceed are being imported. In those circumstances, to talk about making nominally more money by being an exporter is just looking at a silver lining on a dark cloud. I know when I came to this country at Easter in 2020, 1 Swiss franc was 100 Kenya shillings. And yesterday, 1 Swiss franc was 122 Kenya shillings. So it does show a very dramatic change of dynamics. this cannot be justified in any way. And unfortunately, it is a reflection of the pressures we are coming under with declining hard currency earnings, thanks to the very dramatic shrinking of the hospitality industry, the very precipitous decline of international travel and related services, and the slowing down of the export market. So even when you want to say that exporters now get more nominal shillings, the net exports have also shrunk, like across the continent, and Kenya is a victim of that.
All right, on that point by Dr. Kitui takes us to a short break. Business Redefined will be back now, focusing on the domestic environment. We'll be putting trade aside. Don't touch that dial.
Come over. Wacha nikupikie kishaf Ramzi. Yes.
Rina vegetable oil stays liquid to the last drop, so it's smooth cooking from start to finish. Now with an easy-to-pour cap, mapishi poa, madishi poa.
I have to admit, I didn't like sukuma wiki when I was growing up, but now I've created a way to make sukuma wiki tastier and meatier. I simply add 2 Royco beef cubes, and the end result is a rich, meaty flavor. And today, I have brought along my harshest food critics for a taste test. My kids.
More, please!
Royco beef cubes. Add 2 small cubes for a big, meaty taste.
Get fresh, gotta get fresh.
Down is a boom boom pow, down is boom boom pow. Smell kaya na uchafuzi na zidi na improve downy. Protect nguo zangu na nukia niko safi. Lazima niwe fresh na down is boom boom pow. Boom boom pow, down is new boom boom pow. Smell zote na zi boom boom pow. Powerful freshness, down is boom boom pow. Nani 15 bob too?
That's when she replied, give me one good reason to stay with you. Nikamtumia 100 reasons to be my boo. Akanisho unabonga sana kwa text lakini in real life when I'm timid. Hapo nika get minutes ya kupaint picture vivid. Akasema ati I'm in demand. Unadhani DM yangu ni empty? Kumbe nilikuwa nishasotiwa na 100 MB.
Call, SMS, and browse from only 10 shillings with Telkom. Now that's power. Telkom, moving with you.
You're watching Business Redefined in association with KCB Bank.
Welcome back to Business Redefined, your weekly most comprehensive look at the world of business and economics. We are privileged to have the UNCTAD Secretary General, Dr. Mukhisa Kitui. We've been discussing trade in the first part. Let's come back to the domestic market, Dr. Kitui. The subject of debt and lacking debt distress. We've seen what's happened with Zambia. There's so much concern domestically. What are your thoughts on our debt situation?
Our debt situation is moving from a matter of concern to a matter of anxiety. Before COVID came, Kenya's debt service took 40% of public revenue, 40%. And if we are looking at this year, the projected debt service taking 905 billion shillings, and the projected revenue at 1.6 trillion shillings. It is not tenable. It is not a sustainable situation. You know, a few months ago, when the G20, the group of developed countries, succeeded in pledging resources under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, Kenya was one of the first countries to say we are not going on board because it will lower our credit rating among our commercial lenders, which was ridiculous because that statement reduced the appreciation from the commercial lenders, that you are not taking your vulnerability seriously. Luckily, the Kenya government has gone back to the table and said, look, maybe we were wrong. We want to consider the possibility. We are in a situation where a pandemic is hitting us beyond our own anticipation. Nobody expected this phenomenon that is with us. We cannot pretend that things are normal. In this kind of situation, I think we need a war situation mentality about freezing, cutting out the fat. Freeze non-essential expenditure. Rationalize investment in turning around the economy. Build resilience in new economic sectors. And find a way of de-risking investment in startup ecosystem. These are areas that are going to put food on the table for citizens without bloating the public debt that is already very, 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 very discomfortable to look at and uncomfortable to look at.
But Dr. Kitui, to be fair, we were having a conversation, and yesterday you're the one telling us that we should not suspend the relief measures. But the government on the other side has to raise revenue to ensure, when you talk about fiscal consolidation, it must create fiscal space. But how does it do this?
One of the ways to reduce the demand for increased taxes is to reduce expenditure. Government, when I say we have to put ourselves in a war footing in terms of the emergency requirements of turning around, dealing with the health pandemic and repairing a fractured economy with fractured international market outlets and fractured services industry, is don't just say that you'll increase tax. I mean, we have seen in the course of the year, KRA is struggling to meet its targets, even with improved efficiency in collection. And it's just going to continue. As productivity declines, without expanding the revenue base, the taxable base, revenue collection is going to go down. Water the tree at the base. Trigger a livelihood for the poor. Their consumption will trigger a market for the entrepreneur. And that way you have a virtual circle of recovery, digging yourself out of the debt. Just addressing one side that you increase the tax, when the producer has no market because of a shrinking consumer capacity, it's cyclic, it's cyclic way down.
Dr. Kitui, let me go back to something you talked about. In the latest economic recovery strategy by Treasury, there is the consideration of moratorium on debt or debt cancellation where possible, clearly indicating that the government is finally appreciating that indeed we are over-leveraged in a sense. From a signaling standpoint, because if I'm an investor looking at Kenya, and we know Kenya will be going to the market at any point to try and mobilize more resources, how do you think this leaves the country?
There are a number of things. First of all, we can find cover under the global appeal that we've been making at IMF and World Bank, we in the development community, that the uniqueness of the economy of 2020 is such that developed countries which have surplus special drawing rights at IMF, basically meaning the right to print money which they can use but they have not utilized, should surrender their special drawing rights to vulnerable emerging and developing economies, including Kenya. What it means is that instead of going to the commercial markets, we can have multilateral debt at much, much softer terms than what you're getting on the euro market that has become the popular direction of going. Secondly, the commitment to freeze servicing debt is not a statement of an individual country's vulnerability. It's a clarion call that has been embraced by IMF and World Bank that these are unique circumstances. The multilaterals have committed that we are having a moratorium on servicing of public debt. The problem has been getting the commercial markets, the bond markets, to also commit to this pledge. So Kenya is not alone in this. But having said that, if you are announcing that because of your unique circumstances you want a moratorium on debt service, it's not the best preamble to going back into the commercial markets to borrow money. Because basically it means that the insurance cost of what they lend you is going to go up. They're going to ask you for a higher premium. Yeah.
If you look at projections from Treasury, Central Bank, IMF itself, and World Bank, it looks like they're pricing in a V-shaped recovery for the Kenyan economy. They're talking about a contraction in 2020, but a rebound to about 4-5% in 2021. How do you see our recovery?
My sense is a capital U. I think there is an extended bottoming out before you start seeing the recovery. V-shaped recovery has only been witnessed since the COVID in Vietnam and China. and the fundamental conditions that have allowed for that re-triggering of productive capacity and export-driven growth does not apply to Kenya. Yeah, you should see the softness in our key gears in the run-up to the COVID pandemic must be addressed, because we have not just been frozen by the pandemic. Kenya's manufacturing has remained flat, declining as a percentage of GDP. Kenya's agricultural competitiveness has been declining. Kenyans are now consuming onions imported from southern Tanzania and chickens from Uganda. These are pre-existing conditions. So addressing those is not going to be through a magic bullet because IMF and World Bank say so. It's just Kenyans to address what has been behind its declining terms of trade with its neighbors first and foremost, and with the rest of the world also.
When you talk about manufacturing, do you think we are on the right policy mix? And why I ask this question is because if you look at, for example, the Finance Act of 2020, one of the things Treasury did was to withdraw the capital allowances for manufacturers. And the argument was, I mean, we're giving you relief on the income and corporate tax. We surely have to take away from something. The electricity rebates for manufacturers were withdrawn. Do you feel we're on the right policy mix for industry?
An underperforming manufacturing sector needs more reinforcement than more taxation. At the end of the day, the state has to say, what is it I want to forego? The nominal additional revenue they could give me, or the unemployment they suck out of the system? If you don't ask yourself those questions, then you don't rationalize taxation policy measures with the priority sectors that you think are the levers for economic renewal. Similarly, while we have given substantial attention to manufacturing under-bound export processing zones, the transformation of international investment patterns with investment money following trade patterns on shorter value chains, given that year on year in the second quarter of 2020, world in FDI flows were 49% down on 2019. It means that we are hard-pressed to find the resourcing for expanded manufacturing. So if we are going to find a way of giving up a leap to manufacturing, it cannot come from the signals of we take away from this tax and we take you back on another tax.
We're wrapping up, Dr. Kitui. I must ask you this question. You're on your way out from UNCTAD. What's your assessment of your performance? What do you think your legacy will be?
In my first address to my staff, I said this, that UNCTAD is a beautiful Ferrari which is stuck in the garage, and that I was going to service it and put it out on the road. And I think that over the past 7.5 years that I've been leading this organization, I've given it a pride of place and visibility in discourse, in shaping global normative discourse and direction of development, investment, support that had kind of been subdued for some time. So globally, my pride is that we've been able to unlock the capacity of this institution to service in developing countries. But secondly, I have paid significant and substantial, very substantial attention to Africa. I am very, very glad that my personal initiative, for example, in partnership with Jack Ma, triggered a very public engagement on the future of e-commerce on the African continent, and some of the digital tigers and lions that we have been able to get out of my program are important players, not just in creating value, but also in leading the conversation about the future of digital economy. We have done diagnostic studies of 27 LDCs on the state of play and where they need to go on e-commerce. We have done a comprehensive national strategies on the digital economy for Egypt, for Botswana, for Rwanda, Lebanon and Iraq. And I'm glad that in my last month we are embarked upon a similar exercise for Kenya. I have helped to position the new opportunities of the digital revolution as a go-to area for African governments in policy options about how to recover from the crisis, but how to start building the new economy. Yeah.
And that point by Dr. Kitui takes us to the close of our conversation on Business Redefined. Up next is the Markets Report.
Business Redefined in association with KCB Bank.
It is our faith to start all over again. Go Ahead is never giving up in the face of adversity. To go ahead. Now, that is the Kenyan.